conversation is going to be recorded. Thank you, Jill. And we'll do a quick round of intros with our guests before we jump in. What I'd like to hear from each of you is obviously your name, your title, and maybe a line or two about what your role within your organization entails, but also a fun fact about you so our audience know you a little bit better and why you're very passionate about what you're going to talk about today. Maybe we'll start with you, Chris.
Okay. So hi, everybody. Chris Henderson. So I head up our global digital health and value-based solutions team here at Smith & Nephew. So I'm here representing MedTech. So my role is fundamental in defining our short, medium, long-term strategy and innovation pipeline as it relates to both digital health and value-based services that we provide to our health system customers in market. So I suppose a fun fact about me, I have two daughters, one's 6 months old and one's 6 year old. It feels like they're both in their teens already, but so relatively new, slightly old dad, but yeah, enjoying the experience so far, let's say. I think just in context of the discussion today, I think, you know, the fundamental drivers of health are pivoting patients to be much more cared for in their own home, right? I think if we think of ourselves as patients and if we think of ourselves as consumers, I think we all want to experience care as we do anything else, whether that be banking, you know, booking travel, just generally engaging with services in a digitized way. And so many of the sort of paradigms and trends that have shifted our market have ultimately shifted patients to be much more cared for in their own home. That creates opportunities, let's say, but it ultimately creates a lot of challenges around infrastructure, data, health equity, etc. So really excited to have the conversation today and just learn a little bit more of my pharma cousins in terms of what they're up to and looking to. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Abby?
Hi, all. I'm Abby Steibel. I am the Director of Digital Health Transformation at AstraZeneca in our commercial digital health organization. I lead a lot of our strategic partnerships with healthcare technology companies as well as health systems in the US and abroad. Fun fact about me. So I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I am 100% a ski bum and a mountain biker. And during COVID, I brought a Sprinter van so that I could work remotely. We have terrible cell service in the middle of nowhere, though, in the west coast of the US. So I think I need to buy a Starlink satellite and attach that to the van so I can really live the van life. But that's a fun fact about me. And why am I passionate about this space of digital health, hospital at home, remote patient monitoring, all of it? I'm a clinician background. I spent 9 years in clinical medicine, and I left the bedside because of all of the friction, both from a provider and a patient perspective. And I looked around at the healthcare ecosystem and I thought, who has a role to play in transforming healthcare delivery? And I landed with Pharma. And so I believe that digital health platforms can, oh dear, and I'm losing lights. I'll move. Digital health platforms can facilitate the connection between patient and provider. And so this is not a replacement of that relationship, but actually an enhancement. And so I'm really excited to work with a lot of different companies in this space and what they're doing to actually meet patients where they're at and bridge that gap between patient and clinician.
Terrific. Love that story, Abby. Welcome. And finally, Alex.
Amazing. Thanks, Chandana. So hi, everybody. My name is Alex. I have been with Huma for just over 6 years now. I joined Huma as one of our first 10 employees. I think I was employee number 8, if I remember correctly. And since then have mostly been helping us to establish the routes in which we interact with both life sciences, but with all kinds of life sciences organizations, whether that be pharma, medtech, or biotech. And at the moment, I lead on everything that we do within the medtech realm specifically. My interesting fact is I only cry from one eye. I only cry from my left eye due to a head injury when I was a child. And it doesn't have any impact on my life at all now, but it's one that I haven't come across anybody else having so far. So usually tend to start with that one. And in terms of my interest in the space, so I'm very, very passionate about empowering and engaging the patient to take control of their care and really kind of being in the driver's seat when it comes to navigating an episode of care. And so my reason for joining a digital health company was I saw them as the conduit in order to enable kind of an individual who is navigating a care episode to really control that pathway for themselves and enable themselves to kind of act as the coordinator rather than necessarily relying solely on the system around them. And yeah, it's been very, very exciting to see how that's panned out actually in our partnerships with life sciences companies so far, since that interaction point between the three vertices is quite interesting.
That's awesome. Welcome. And my name is Chandana. I'm the CEO at HealthXL. I have a lot in common with Abby and Alex, so I love both your stories. I have been an early employee of multiple startups, and Abby, I've also been a physician in a previous life and share similar passions to you. So I'm really excited to have all of you here with us today. To kick us off, maybe, Alex, I'll look to you to maybe give us a couple of case studies, actually, of the work that you've done with both Smith & Nephew and AstraZeneca, and just help us think through what challenge did you really solve when it came to hospital at home, and maybe talk a little bit about the composition of the solution. We'll obviously dig into all of that as we go, but maybe just a quick sneak peek at it.
Sorry, I just need to unmute myself again. Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to provide a bit of a background. And I think it's relevant. Our journey as an organization is very relevant to the topic. So Huma as an organization initially started very much as a remote patient monitoring company, which is still a huge part of what we do. So our the foundations of what we do is very much built within a hospital at home setting. The core focus of our organization was how do we connect patients to the physician outside of the hospital, with the main goal being that, in most instances, patients are spending 95, 99% of their time outside of the hospital, and they're generating all of this information about their day-to-day lives in relation to the condition that they're treating that is not being captured sufficiently. And so that's what initially led us to establishing the Huma platform. And then as that journey grew and as we kind of expanded as an organization, went from working just in the UK to starting to work kind of globally with healthcare systems, we also then started to interact with life sciences companies. And I think that's now becoming more and more of what we do. And kind of it's been a huge amount of learning that we've had as a result of that we're hoping to kind of share as part of this conversation. And two of the partners that we've worked with very closely, and I would say probably are closest in terms of the medical device and pharmaceutical side, are AstraZeneca and Smith & Nephew. So I'm just going to resume the share. Can you guys see my shared screen now? Perfect. Right, so I'm going to start with AZ. They're a slightly more recent partner, but I think are developing into a very, very interesting type of partnership. And I think certainly a very close one from its very inception, to be honest. So we've been speaking with AZ for a very long time, I think certainly since even I joined the organization, but kind of spent a very long time exploring the different methodologies in which we could partner, how we could best benefit each other, and really kind of figuring it out in terms of, what are the key value drivers for either business. And actually the first value came to us, or the idea for the first element of value came during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we did some exploratory work to work together specifically within COVID-19 research. And that initial kind of small element of partnering with each other is actually what led us to really develop a much larger amount of comfort with each other, to the point where now most recently in March 2022, we actually acquired an internal AstraZeneca platform called Amaze in exchange for AstraZeneca taking a stake in Huma, which was a really, really interesting deal from an industry perspective, because it was essentially this exchange of understanding in terms of, this is what you guys are good at, this is what we're good at. If we actually play to our strengths and establish a strong partnership, we can ultimately both benefit our ultimate consumer or customer, which is the hospital. And so our current focus is on creating companion solutions, specifically in respiratory care, with the goal being that we're, again, kind of enabling the patient to access high-level quality respiratory care outside of the context of the hospital. And so initially we've started with a program that is deploying in the US. The goal is to kind of take that to the UK soon. And certainly the partnership itself is a very global one. That kind of exchange of stake and kind of the meaning of AZ taking a stake in Huma was essentially for Huma to become AZ's almost default digital partner. And so we're starting in an area that I think is very comfortable for AstraZeneca and for us in terms of management of chronic conditions like COPD and asthma. But the goal is to really expand and explore beyond that as well. So this notion of a journey that kind of starts within one small space and then continuously grows over time is one that's very, very relevant to us as a business. And actually a great representative of that journey and kind of going, starting small and building from there is the work that we've done with Smith & Nephew.
Alex,
yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I don't think your slides are moving.
Oh, no worries. Let me.
So maybe we can leave the AstraZeneca slide on for a minute and then we can move on to the Smith & Nephew slide.
Let me reshare that for us.
No problem. Perfect. We see Smith & Nephew now.
Amazing. Perfect. Yeah, and can you see it full screen or is it kind of a small version?
A small version.
Okay, it's full screen for me. Well, anyway, I will talk you through it regardless, and I'm more than happy to share these slides afterwards as well. But to give you a bit of idea, so I was mentioning that the notion or the idea that kind of is really relevant with Smith & Nephew is this idea of starting small and then building over time. And I think Smith & Nephew is a great example of that because initially when we started working with Smith & Nephew in 2018, the idea was that we were going to build a registry solely for the purpose of total knee replacement surgeries. And as we kind of explored different avenues together and the partnership grew in different ways, we actually realized that there was a whole lot more that we could be doing. And Smith & Nephew as a business also understood that they wanted a piece and a part to play in actually augmenting the patient pathway and supporting the patient throughout kind of the pre and post-operative journey, rather than necessarily just kind of with an implant or a product. And so the solution expanded from a registry solution to more a kind of companion app again. So really enabling that hospital at home type work with different kind of customers on the Smith & Nephew side. But then it also expanded quite substantially across the portfolio. So we started in orthopedics, we developed solutions for knee and for hip replacements. We then grew into sports medicine, where we started to work within knee repair and have expanded to shoulder repair as well. And we've even now started to work with wound, which has been hugely exciting. Chris has been leading a lot of that work. And that, again, is kind of augmenting the methodologies of how we partner together to really be able to impact patients today. What I think has been really interesting as a learning there is kind of actually seeing, okay, we've had these very standardized therapeutic areas so far. In wound care, we have a novel opportunity and a different way of working. And that means going through a process of rediscovery with each other about exactly what the value drivers are, which we can certainly talk about. But within each of these, the common thread is that they are aimed at and are solutions that are being provided to Smith & Nephew customers to ultimately help them augment the patient pathway, lead to kind of more establishment of things like virtual wards, remote patient monitoring, pre and post-operative engagement, with the ultimate goal being to establish hospital at home systems to reduce the burden on the in-hospital systems. And finally, again, a really good example of kind of starting small and scaling here. Initially, we were planning on doing this in the UK for 200 patients. We now have 15 different countries that are in process of launch, deployment, and scale. And we've covered over 12 different clinical pathways with some really incredible patient feedback as well, which has been really, really wonderful to get. But I hope that that's seen a bit for the work that we've done with each other in the context of the conversation.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for walking us through that, Alex. And I'm sure we'll dig into lots of aspects of that as we go. For the next 45 minutes, what I'd like to hone in on is that entire end-to-end journey from problem identification, which gap do we want to fill, to how the partnership came about, the operating model within the partnership, and then finally talk a little bit about the outcomes and KPIs that have been achieved as a result. So maybe Chris and Abby, starting with you, within your organizations, how did you hone in on the exact problem statement that you wanted to solve for? Because there's always so many things to do.
I think just to give a sort of a high level sort of answer to that, I think, for me, the intrinsic challenges with hospital at home is less about product and it's more about people and process. So I think for me, the challenge that we were trying to understand was how do we bridge those fragmented aspects of the care continuum, right? And that was across orthopedic, sports, and wound care. I think from our perspective, we have very clear value proposition in the treatment in the box of product A or box of product B. However, the whole challenge of, more patients, fewer carers, less skills, less time, for me, it was ultimately around the orchestration of how do we make sure the product is being used on the right patient, and how do we engage the patient in their care, and how do we help standardize and reduce the sort of variation that we see in terms of clinical practice across the board. And so where we saw opportunities was at either end of the care continuum, which was how do we effectively onboard patients to their healthcare experience, and post-surgery and post-treatment, how do we make sure that we're achieving the outcomes that we set out to? So I think in terms of aligning those incentives, ultimately our aspiration and incentive as Smith & Nephew is to ultimately improve patient outcomes at a lower cost, right? Which, I get it, sounds totally cliche, but ultimately is what we're all aspiring to achieve, equally with our health system partners as well. We cannot do that if all we do is to offer the product, right? So we have to understand how do we orchestrate that pre-op, peri-op, post-op experience for the patient, and how do we democratize access to data for different stakeholders across that care continuum as well. So that's kind of a high level where I would probably point the answer to.
And Chris, just to double click before Abby comes in, so within that broad range of, that broader context, how did you engage Huma? How did that relationship come about? Because you obviously had a very specific need when you found Huma.
Yeah, I'd sort of call out to Alex as well, because I think the Huma relationship actually started before my time. But I think my understanding is that the registry piece was the kind of first and foremost. It was ultimately around evidence generation. But I think the partnership evolved, and we saw the utility and benefit of Huma beyond just a registry collection support. And I don't know, Alex, whether you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and actually it mirrors a lot of our other relationships, and where I think we've found the strongest relationships is we've started with solutions for problems that pre-exist digital health, the need for kind of information, the need for data, the need for kind of establishing a portfolio for a product so that you can then support it commercially in different ways. And by going in kind of with Smith & Nephew initially with something that was very, usual for them, a registry for a solution, it allowed us to then kind of build advocacy within the business for the overall Huma vision, which is a bit kind of more beyond the reaches of what would be day-to-day business at, a medical device company or a pharma. And in terms of kind of really amping up that piece on kind of improving patient outcomes, patient experience, kind of augmenting the pathway beyond the product itself. So initially we started with, hey, Smith & Nephew just needed a registry, and, we have a tool that does data collection. And actually, I think the first change that then kind of started to take to the next level was, oh, well, how about you add some educational content on there so that the patient, maybe learn something they're putting in this data.
Yeah.
And, kind of step by step, we then kind of championed it within the business to push it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I was going to add to that, actually, and I think in the relationship that we've had since 2018, I think the market drivers have changed in that time as well, right? So I think if you think of data points, particularly in the hospital home setting, which is patient reported outcome measures, patient reported experience measures, all of those things that are intrinsically really difficult to get for a health system, and actually a lot of health systems are incentivized to gather that data, but they don't really have avenues to do that. I think even in the UK still, they literally post a survey through the letterbox of patients with the hope, fingers crossed,
yeah,
patient will fill these things out, right? So I think we were seeing ourselves as actually we can augment a solution that enables health systems to capture those patient experience measures to help proactively guide the health system and the hospital to making sure that the care they're delivering is equitable and patient satisfaction, experience, and quality of life is being met as well. So I think that was the sort of paradigm that's changed as well. And I think that's going to continue to increase over time.
Yeah. And maybe Abby, if you want to add to that, and I guess for all our listeners, I'm also trying to bring in the angle of if they're representing a life sciences company, how do they find the right partner to solve a specific problem? And of course, for all the tech companies and startups listening in, how do they navigate and reach the right problem statements that they can solve for as well? So I'm trying to get some of those nuggets out. But Abby, I would love to hear what is the specific problem that AstraZeneca was trying to solve.
Yeah, so we're very focused on right patient, right therapy, right time. And those are hard things to achieve. There's massive opportunity. I'll speak specifically in the biopharmaceutical space, which is where where Amaze started and where we've started with Huma. There's still a tremendous opportunity because a large volume of patients remain undiagnosed and or misdiagnosed. So just starting at the beginning of the patient journey and capturing patients, and that's tied to actually the large amount of evidence that we build as life science companies. We may be published in the New England Journal and the Lancet, and we may be issuing publications in double digits every year, but translating that clinical evidence into practice takes anywhere between 10 to 15 years. So there's huge opportunity to identify patients and diagnose them correctly. And we are fueling a ton of evidence generation with a high rigor of science behind it. But there's this massive gap of actually using that evidence and changing clinical practice. And that is where, from an AstraZeneca perspective, we believed that if we invested in either building or partnering, which is always the question in large corporate, do we build or do we partner? Could we actually identify the right patients and take that evidence and translate it into clinical practice and shorten the time to do that? If we're embedded into the clinical workflow with digital tools such as a Huma platform, we believe that that's where we could actually move the needle of improving identification, diagnosis, and guideline-based medical therapy. So really the aim is practice change. And to do that at scale, that is something that's very difficult for a pharmaceutical company to do internally. And so we believed that we brought the scientific and the clinical expertise to build the Amaze platform, to take it through some early evidence generation and to do it with the rigor that a life science company eats, sleeps, and breathes. But when it came to actually scaling, that needed to come with a partner. And that partner needed to have geographic reach, a regulatory backbone that gave us confidence that this can be deployed in clinical settings and trusted by the user, both from a patient and provider. And AstraZeneca needed to remain at an arm's length. And this is something that we've continued with Huma. In our first deployments, this is truly disease management. So it is not branded AstraZeneca. It's not tied to, it's not a companion app in a traditional sense of tied to one of our therapies or molecules. It really is meant to be disease state embedded into the clinical workflows, translating that clinical evidence into practice and doing a better job of identifying patients and getting them on right diagnosis, right therapy, right time.
Thank you. That was really articulate. But if I can just double click on what both of you said, there's so many clearly external stakeholders that you needed buy-in from before initiating practice change or attempting to initiate practice change. Did you get those? And now I'm almost kind of moving into the actual program execution, so to speak. So did you actually align those external stakeholders, in this case, health systems, providers, to actually figure out that that's what they wanted before going ahead with it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually, and I think the refreshing thing, actually, the comment I would make on that is, actually, a lot of our customers don't know. They don't really understand what the value of this thing's going to be, and I think both the strategy and execution of a solution and a partnership like Huma is experimental and is iterative, right? I think that's the sort of the feedback I would give, and so I think from my perspective, we've never gone to a health system with a sort of baked idea of the value this thing will add. I think directionally we know that it's going to add value, but until we get the solution in the hands of patients and get that feedback, we're not really going to understand the value. And so I think the value proposition, if you will, is therefore iterative, and ultimately the business model off the back of that is also iterative over time. And I think that will remain the same for the foreseeable, particularly in the context of digital health, right?
Yeah, very true. Abby?
So coming from the provider space, I had a sense of what was happening and what the needs were, but I'm just one person. So when we started with the initial vision of the Amaze platform, I actually immediately said, this is not even worth going down the path until we have a flagship health system partner, at least one. And so with Amaze, our partner happened to be Mass General, which is a unique health system in the US in that it's an academic medical center. So is it what's happening in rural areas in clinical care? Perhaps not, but they understand the rigor of what it takes to actually develop, deploy digital tools and build the evidence behind it. And they are pumping out massive amounts of clinical evidence across therapeutic areas and moving the needle on how we practice clinical medicine. So we did a true embed. We just literally, the team spent Monday through Friday in Boston, embedded with clinicians, understanding their needs. As we deployed it in a clinical evidence setting, we were sitting with patients, providers, our team was. So we became part of the MGH family, and MGH became part of the AZ family. That's what it took.
And that's great, right? I think that's probably the right approach.
Yeah. And we did all of this in COVID. So we got like 6 weeks on the ground and then COVID hit. And so we had to do this all remote under, the stress of COVID breaking health systems. So it really truly took a commitment to the mission and the vision of this program and a phenomenal amount of trust.
Wow. I'll come back to you and maybe ask you what was most instrumental in getting that commitment internally from within the organization. But before that, Alex, maybe some 101s, right? Because these are things that everybody has to navigate, but maybe we don't talk enough about. What was the deal flow like? What was the sales cycle? Talk about the contracting. So right from your initiation of the first conversation all the way through to contract signing and, hey, we're partners now. Maybe talk us through that and what that entails, so anybody listening can also learn what to do or not to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have the benefit of being a commercial person who's also, surprisingly to myself, actually, a massive legal nerd as well, who actually enjoys the kind of process of contracting and kind of getting through to kind of an agreement between kind of two organizations on paper. But what I will say is that kind of, I think my learning that I would pass on to other organizations within this space is that, however long you think the deal is going to take to sign, double that mentally. Because it is going to take a very long time. And that is not because there is an interest. It's not because there isn't kind of a want or a need. It's more so that we are operating in a space that is still realistically in its infancy. And the large organizations that partner in this space don't necessarily have a wealth of experience to then bring to the table in terms of navigating, okay, well, this is the approval, this is the way to get this approved, this is the way that I kind of navigate getting this purchased internally, this is the assigned budget for XYZ. I've seen over the past kind of couple of years that maturity grow, but even then we're still not at a phase where, kind of this is as cut and clear as necessarily as, when purchasing other services when you're a life sciences organization. And so in order to help with that length of time, one of the things that you can do is you can actually take more of an active leadership role in terms of navigating something forward. If you have the right champion in place, and if you have the kind of right understanding of what either business wants to achieve, and you can understand what the value drivers are, actually being able to be more of a guide than necessarily just following the process on the other side is sometimes more helpful than you think. I think a lot of digital health companies tend to worry about, oh, it's Pharma or it's MedTech, they have a lot of established processes and, kind of a lot of stuff that we have to navigate. Actually, a lot of times they're still figuring out a lot of them as well for this. So you actually have to say, hey, this is our regulatory portfolio, and this is these are our ISO qualifications, and this is why this is relevant, and you should check this with X, Y, and Z type of person. That guiding hand was actually really helpful in terms of then pushing things forward a lot quicker. The other one, which I think is also essential, is understanding what is the actual value that you're bringing. I think pre and during COVID, digital health was very much people were thinking we should be doing this. And so everybody was doing digital health projects because they should be doing digital health projects. And now I think people have realized, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing all of the digital health projects. We should be figuring out what are the key ones that are actually going to bring the business value in specific aspects. And then let's prioritize those kinds of projects. And I think it was beneficial going through that phase because it led to a lot of activity within the industry that otherwise would not have been there, and was beneficial to grow the industry. But now is really the point where we have to actually exhibit, okay, how are you impacting in different ways? Are you going to be making these businesses more kind of revenue because they ultimately are businesses? Are you going to be saving them costs? Usually it's those two. But then I think the third one that is emerging more and more is kind of, are you actually impacting the patient positively? Are you improving outcomes? Ultimately, and hopefully that leads to kind of both a reduction in cost as well as an improvement in revenue. But people are willing to kind of set those aside if you can actually see a kind of improvement in outcomes. And so knowing kind of which value drivers you're really kind of focused on will then lead you to kind of having much more fruitful conversations and much more respected conversations in the business.
Really helpful. Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I was trying to be a good panelist and kind of answer some questions on the chat.
I'm going to bring them up. I'm going to bring them up. Yeah, no, keep the questions coming, and I'll bring them up as and when it's relevant to the.
I was trying to multitask. As a guy, I can say I struggle with that, but I think I was doing all right. No, I think the overall sentiment there is that I think there are relatively clear direct and indirect measures of value for deploying solutions like this. And I think for the startups on the call, I think that getting that alignment of what those value drivers are, I think is really critical. So when we talk about direct value drivers, you're thinking product pull-through, revenue, price optimization, things like that. The indirect things are more, competitive differentiation, reputation, data, evidence, and so I think for me there's a spectrum there, and I think to Alex's point, it's a case of aligning between organizations on what is the thing we're going to go after, and you can't go after all of that. You have to kind of pick your area. And I think that's ultimately how an organization like Smith & Nephew would ultimately assess the ROI of a relationship with a startup or a digital health native, is really making sure there's core alignment on what value levers we're focusing on. And ultimately, is the solution on point with the strategy of our organization, the strategy and vision and the focus areas, but also is it synergistic with our current business model? So is deploying this solution disruptive to either our sales reps on the ground? Is it going to create new friction points, new call points for us, new stakeholders that we've never spoken to before? And so I think the inference there is that, we can't assume that MedTech and Pharma have the sort of tacit knowledge and capabilities to engage with CIOs and engage in IT infrastructure and EMR integration and all those sorts of things. So our expectation of our digital health partners are not only to support with the product, but with the fundamental technical process, architecture, data, security, all that stuff, which Alex loves, which we're not,
I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris, because I wanted to ask about what is each of your roles in the partnership, right? Because I think that clear definition and clarity is really important to actually be successful in the partnership. So maybe talk us through, like you said, what are those product elements that the tech company has to handle? What are maybe the evidence elements once you've received the data that the pharmaceutical company or Smith & Nephew will handle?
Yeah. I mean, I maybe do a bit of a duo with Abby on this one, but I would say that, you know, as an established, I think Smith and Nephew, you know, was founded in 1856, right? So I think we've founded a great business, which is, you know, we have a large commercial footprint and we have great account relationships. So I think our role is around socializing the technology with great accounts where we have great relationships. You know, supporting with the onboarding. I think from our perspective, you know, we have an intrinsic interest in making sure that the solution or the deployment is going to drive the outcomes we aspire to, whether those are direct or indirect, as we mentioned earlier. So I think from our perspective, it's the initial integration into our value proposition, socializing of the solution, and then I suppose from a training, onboarding, managing all the technical aspect, that's where we would look at a partner to do that piece. And the kind of out of the sausage machine comes all the data, right? And so the data aspect is really critical, and ultimately that's how we demonstrate the value of the partnership. But the orchestration of that data in terms of anonymizing the data, feeding it back into a centralized cloud, whether that's a US-based server, a European server, or, you know, it gets quite complicated. So there's an engagement there between a company like Huma, our IT organization, regulatory compliance, and so I'm not going to say it's fun, but it's certainly a process that we have to go through. And so I think, you know, and ultimately for an organization like Smith and Nephew, this is relatively new territory. So whilst we're upskilling and building capabilities intrinsically in things like software as medical device, data ownership, data governance, etc., I think partnerships, and certainly when we think of digital health partnerships, I think we have an over reliance on them to be able to help orchestrate that data and that technical aspect, because we assume that's part of their core competency.
Yeah. And Abby, what about you?
Yeah. So absolutely. AstraZeneca, 80,000 person footprint in multiple geographies. We can serve as the introductory to a partner like Huma, but it is paramount that we remain in an arm's length. So we should not be leading the commercialization. We cannot be we complicate a lot of things if we get in the way of contracting and data and all of those sorts of things. So we've really, with this partnership with Huma, made sure that we have very clear roles and responsibilities across the partnership. But one thing I wanted to add to Chris's was the call out of, and I think speaking to the startup community here that sells into life sciences, this will resonate. It's somewhat easy to land. It's very difficult to expand. We're a large organization with a lot of silos. And so for a partnership, what was key to the strategy with AZ and Huma was, we'll start small, we'll prove the value in a single geography, in a single use case. And once we start delivering that, we then expand to other geographies and other therapeutic areas. Well, to do that expansion, you need people inside the walls of AZ that understand how an 80,000 person life science company is organized and can do that internal stakeholder management to build the pipeline of projects and scale that will deliver on the strategic aim of multiple geographies, multiple therapeutic areas, with a select strategic partner. And so a lot of my job, I am managing the partnership with Huma, but a lot of my job is spent managing the AZ stakeholders and continuing to socialize and change behavior and talk about ROI in a different way. Most of my job, I would say probably 70% of it, is inside the walls of AZ, wow, changing the internal environment.
Wow, really helpful to know that upfront, right? That's a big number, but really important. That's an important piece. I'm going to address a couple of questions because it was, aligned with some of the previous comments that have been made. What clinical evidence have you captured so far with Amaze?
Yeah, so they're going to publication, so I can't speak to it because the evidence was done as interventional studies with the aim of actually publishing in journals. So asthma has been submitted to a journal. Heart failure is in draft mode, but what I can say is the early signs are dramatic improvement in outcomes. And I think we all, I don't know the attendees, but anyone who's in this digital health space, we can learn from all the evidence that's already out there. There's huge opportunities to move the needle on patient outcomes because the system's overrun, overburdened. There's a loss of providers, and there's a growing complexity of disease as well. So there's so much opportunity to move that needle. I often say just like sprinkle a little bit of pixie dust and it goes a long way. And I do think that the evidence is there. You will see evidence in the public domain soon in these publications, but to Huma's benefit, they have a large volume of evidence, and this was another key piece of the partnership for Pharma, was that evidence generation done with rigor is something that is valuable to Huma. So all of the deployments we do with them has an evidence generation plan from day one, because we know we are still somewhat leading the science in this space. And for clinical adoption, for payers to contribute to this, for that shared funding model, it requires evidence.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that,
Yeah.
Chandra, in terms of the clinical evidence piece, for sure. I think that I've definitely seen the value of that more and more as the digital health industry has matured. It goes back to kind of that vision of value and what are you contributing. And a hospital and a healthcare system has a lot more kind of trust if they can see that there is kind of a real outcome from prior experience that they can then showcase. We're not at a point yet where I think every organization has evidence in every area that we're working with. And certainly for us, it's a developing portfolio. We work in over 20 different therapeutic areas. So, we kind of have to rely almost on these kind of joint programs to then establish some of that clinical evidence. And actually, one of the big benefits of partnering with a large-scale life sciences organization is that they come with, experience going as far as the 1800s and over 80,000 people that actually kind of have experience in running trials, running kind of research programs, being able to kind of look at an evidence generation portfolio that then adds so much more kind of in terms of strength for us when we're looking at really expanding that side of it ourselves.
Okay. And I guess we'll wait for that release, Abby, on the results. Can the panelists speak to more details about what they're doing with hospital at home? So more specific services or activities beyond traditional remote monitoring or registries?
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of give a bit of coverage on that. So because of the variety of different kinds of indications that we're interacting with, each element of them kind of has a different hospital at home type solution, in my view. So we have kind of more, so starting with, let's say the most kind of virtual ward solution or kind of hospital at home solution I think that we've done so far, which enabled fully remote care, was when we were doing COVID-19 work. That was kind of fully at home, no in-person interactions, with the main goal being kind of how do you actually completely eliminate the burden on the health system in terms of a bed being taken up, but also offer somebody all of the benefits that they would have received in their own home. And that obviously work actually led to some of our initial interactions or kind of initial business with AstraZeneca. Now, the work that we do with other indications is different in terms of hospital at home. So when I look at kind of orthopedics, for example, or sports medicine with Smith & Nephew, that's more so around, okay, post-operative recovery, can we kind of offer the role of a physiotherapist almost and kind of a guide in terms of that post-operative period? Can we do a preoperative assessment in the comfort of your own home? Can we kind of provide you with, again, all of the kind of services that you would be able to benefit from by going in for a visit without actually going in for a visit? Unfortunately, we're not able to offer you the actual surgery yet via app, but we'll see how far we can get. And wound care is another really interesting one. Wound care is hugely diverse as an industry and kind of as part of the healthcare system, in the sense that there are no established methodologies for managing wound care. And so actually, in the sense of offering a hospital at home, it's actually being able to maybe provide you with a bit more of a standardized pathway for wound management, while simultaneously, again, kind of keeping somebody comfortable within their own space, rather than necessarily forcing them to go into a hospital, or even, God forbid, kind of taking up a ward bed due to their wound. So there's a lot of diversity across different kinds of indications. And actually, the main thread across all of them has been, how do you, again, kind of put that patient in the kind of seat of empowerment, in the driver's seat, to be able to manage their care as if they were in a hospital, or as if they themselves were almost at the level of a physician, whilst allowing the right interaction points with that kind of provider to actually help them navigate that when it's most critical.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Alex, because isn't that so important? Because you can absolutely see all the use cases and examples you mentioned. You can apply that in a different setting. You can apply that in clinical trials, but that's from a product point of view. But I think is that actually essential to the end user? It could be a clinician, it could be a patient in that specific use case. So thank you for taking that question. We spoke a little bit, and I want to make sure we touch on it, about outcomes and KPIs, right? So when the partnership was initiated, did you define as a collective, as a partnership, what the expected outcomes and KPIs from this partnership was going to be, and in what timelines?
I mean, I can again maybe start on that one, then Abby and Chris can come in from their side. I mean, I'll be honest, the outcomes and KPIs on our side at least evolved over time. And that's because I think it's very important. Again, this is advice to kind of the other digital health companies, or just generally kind of smaller organizations partnering with larger organizations. If you go in with a very open and honest mindset of, look, we're figuring this out, you're figuring this out, but what we're going to develop is a trusting relationship where we have the kind of opportunity to figure it out together. That leads to a much stronger long-term business relationship than necessarily having a hyper strict level of kind of established things that you're trying to do together. Because if I look back at kind of what we wanted to do as a business in 2018, when we started working with Smith & Nephew, it's very different. Well, it's not different. It's a teeny tiny small bit of kind of what I think we want to do now. And if I look back even further than that, to kind of 6-7 years ago, again, kind of the ambitions and the things that we wanted to achieve, and the way in which we wanted to deliver impact, and the way in which we thought we could deliver impact was much smaller. One of the things that Dan, Huma's founder, said to me once when I was getting frustrated about a lack of results is that it takes 5 years to see the result. And it does. I realize now, that over the 6 years, is that I could see the things that I was kind of really thinking were going to happen soon 5 years ago are now actually happening. And so I think it's good to have a high level view of, okay, we want to impact X, Y, and Z without necessarily being hyper focused on just a few key metrics.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, and I think if you were to take a platform-based partner like Huma, who ultimately lend their hand to multiple therapeutic areas, as we engage with a company like Huma to build a discrete solution around obstetrics or orthopedic or sports med, as we look at that, we're in theory creating a new digital health solution, right? So if you can imagine as a startup, you're going through that experimentation, you're going through that learning, that sort of continuous feedback. And that's the process that we go on as well. We don't, and to Alex's point, we have a aspiration. Ultimately, we fund the development, we fund the licensing, we fund the whole initiative with the aspiration of driving business value and customer value. But I think that to echo Alex's sentiment, I think for us, it's the ROI is as experimental as the actual deployment and implementation of the solution, which sometimes is quite culturally difficult for an organization like Smith & Nephew, and I think Abby's nodding as well, and probably for AZ. But I think that's why, and without kind of diverging into a totally different topic, the cultural transformation and nurturing that's required to embed this way of thinking within an organization that's traditionally minded, ultimately that iteration, that experimentation, which is intrinsic in digital health, is something that we're still fitting in terms of getting into that rhythm from a MedTech perspective. So I think just to kind of summarize, I think the ROI is aspirational, it's defined, but if it diverges along the way, that's okay.
Very interesting. This is a really interesting perspective from both of you. Maybe Abby, I'll let you come in before I follow that up with another question.
To Chris's point, this is a huge change management exercise and a cultural shift for life science companies to have a renewed vision on how to actually measure the value of programs like digital health companies. Even our partnership with Huma, this is something I'm doing almost daily, is changing the way that our leadership measures the value of these. And we have very traditional ways of measuring investments. We're a life science company, so we know if we spend X on advertising, this is the X return we're going to receive, and we're going to receive it in this very clear timeline. That is not the case in digital health and in these kinds of programs. So it's really rephrasing. This is what we're going to achieve in the short term. This is what we're going to achieve in the midterm. And this is what we're going to achieve in the long term. And the timelines we're talking about short term is 12 to 18 months, which is still extremely aggressive to start seeing results that quickly. And the results are different that you're going to get in 12 to 18 months. Then you're going to start to see maybe some early signs of clinical outcome change in that 18-month to 3-year period. And then you're going to see clinical practice change, where this is actually changing the standard operating procedures at the healthcare providers, 3 to 5 years. So those and this is ever evolving. Again, this comes from the learnings we've had in the 1 year embedded with Huma and through our multiple other partnerships. But it's a complete ethos change.
Yeah, that's super interesting, right? I guess it's a little bit different to the stuff we hear externally, but that's probably because of the macroeconomic pressures that companies are potentially facing as well, because these partnerships are being challenged. Because when you just look back into a short time frame, like you just said, 1 year, 2 years, it's hard to establish really significant changes, like changes in clinical practice, changes in guideline management, changes in the way in your workflow. So I understand that, but that is a really interesting perspective. Can we talk a little bit about the impact that some of these initiatives have had on hospital at home? I know we said we can't measure it, but there's some incremental value add that's happened since the initiation of this program, right? So it'd be great to hear about those, even if not in concrete metrics, but what has been the value change or addition?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, just from a delivery perspective, I think having seen some of these projects go live and kind of interacted with some of the clinicians, I think one of the most interesting points actually has been how diverse, depending on the geography and the clinician, the impact is. For patients, it's pretty similar across the board. I think, patients feel more engaged, they feel kind of better educated about kind of their system of care. They feel like they're more kind of in touch with the system, which generally tends to be quite positive overall for them. So the patient feedback, I'd say, across the programs that we've delivered in hospital at home tends to be similar. They feel safer, they feel better taken care of, they feel better, which is incredible. And we've also then been able to kind of see, other impacts in different disease areas of, either higher adherence rates, but maybe in certain conditions to, kind of reduce length of stay or whatever it may be. But again, that'll divert a lot. The clinician feedback, and I saw there's a question in the chat about that specifically as well, has been a lot more diverse because each of them at the moment are doing it for different reasons. Some of them are very research minded. And so actually establishing a digital method of clinic management means that they can collect more information that ultimately leads to kind of better insights in the future. Some of them are really interested in kind of improving their day-to-day management of the clinic in terms of patient interactions. And so actually having more information allows them to have better patient interactions. And then some of them really kind of want to have the patient have a better experience, improve the patient experience. And so it's more about, okay, how do we support the patient? And what's been great is being able to And it may be the kind of flexibility that we have in our platform, but I think it's actually more so just the availability of a digital tool has been able to solve those issues for them and has been able to kind of provide that for them. It's rare that I've seen, I don't think I've ever seen actually kind of an engaged clinic not ultimately enjoy or kind of benefit from using the solution. If the engagement is there, the benefit tends to happen because there is so much that can be kind of improved upon and kind of fixed and changed and augmented. It's only kind of where there's, when they're not maybe ready or they don't have the right kind of system in place to adopt a digital solution that they don't actually end up seeing benefits in the short to midterm.
And Abby and Chris, what about from your organization point of view in terms of making advancements towards the grander goal?
I mean, I think I might be a little bold in saying this, but the life science business model is being forced to change at a very fast clip. And we're seeing this, and you mentioned this at the start, patients are becoming more empowered. They want to care. And so healthcare is becoming more consumer centric. And so as a life science company, we have to meet our customers, patients and HCPs where they're at. And we need to actually bring solutions to them that add value. So this is, we're early days with Huma, but some of the just anecdotal evidence when we're talking to HCPs and Huma's bringing their solution is, I'll never forget, I got a text message from someone saying, thank you for thinking of us. As a healthcare provider, hearing that from a healthcare provider, thank you for thinking of us. We're drowning. We are literally drowning, trying to manage our patients. And we need tools such as this to help us care for the sick when they're sick, divert the well when they're well, and make us more efficient so we can actually practice the art of medicine. And that gives me incredible hope. And I mean, we're talking to providers that are still using paper charts in very rural areas in middle America, where most of their population is 65 and older and struggle to use technology. So they're calling their practice 8 times a day to get a hold of the providers, or they're texting their clinicians. No one can sustain that. And then we're talking to really advanced systems that have huge technology, digital front door, all of the access, but still are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of patients and the need that they are having to connect with their providers and leverage space, leverage their homes and technology to actually improve the care delivery of patients. So, I mean, early signs, but dramatic, huge opportunity, and the right solution fit with the understanding that this isn't just a tech solution. This is tech plus people plus process plus change management.
I like that. And we're at time. So I think that formula is actually a perfect end to the conversation. So we'll leave people with that it's not just, it's a multifactorial approach. I do want to take this opportunity to thank all 3 of you. This has been such a terrific conversation and a really candid one at that. So thank you so much, Alex, Abby, and Chris, for sharing your story with us, as well as your perspectives for the future. Good luck with the future of your partnerships, because as you said, we're still in the short-term part of it. So would love to hear more about it as the years go. And thank you to everybody for joining. We'll be sharing a recording of this after.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Well,
Bye.
Everybody.
Thanks, everyone.